Hey, I'm Julie Rose. Welcome to Love What You Love. I'm an author, creator, and enthusiast, and I've always been fascinated by the things that people are super into, because they're always a unique expression of curiosity and joy and wonder. So every week, I'll introduce you to another fascinating human who's into really interesting stuff. Welcome back, or welcome. This podcast exists to give you a bit of a rest, a bit of a respite, and to add a little light to the world. I can't believe we're in double digits now, episode 11. As you can probably tell, this podcast is something I'm incredibly passionate about, and I'm so grateful for everyone's support. If you'd like to support the podcast, leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, even if that's not where you listen, is a great way to do that. We're also on Patreon. Patron support means that I can pay for my syndication service, episode transcriptions, and more. So a huge thank you to patrons Scott, Cindy, Lindsay, Ulrika, Deb, Emily, Rhonda, and Allie for supporting Love What You Love. If you'd like to learn more about patron benefits or to join that merry crew, visit patreon.com/lovewhatyoulovepod. Okay, on to this week's guest, and I'm so excited for you to meet her. Pauline Loven is an experienced historical costumer and one of the 3 women running Crow's Eye Productions, a film company with a popular YouTube channel. In our conversation, we talk about making connections across time and space, history in your own backyard, embracing mistakes, and so much more. So find out why Pauline loves historical costume and why you might learn to love it too. Hey, Pauline, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're very welcome. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk to you. So you are an historical costumer. I don't know if that's the title you give yourself. Okay, good. The way I came to know about you is through Crow's Eye Productions, which is a woman-owned, woman-led production company, film production company on YouTube, and I'm sure other places. You have 300,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is incredible.
It's extraordinary.
And so some of the things you do is like getting dressed in, insert time period, some behind the scenes photo shoot diaries, things like that. Walk with Me, which has been, so that's Liv gets dressed up in a certain period costume and goes for a walk, and it's just beautiful and lovely and so good during this lockdown.
It's about all we can do at the moment as well.
Right. So what I wanted to understand is that's a lot of subscribers, that's a lot of work. How did you get into historical costuming? And then what was the genesis of Crow's Eye Productions?
I'm a grandmother in my 60s. I've been sewing, I think, since I was about 5, but my big passion was history. And I think I was about in my mid-30s, when I realized that my creative passions and my love of history could come together in this brilliant way of discovering and learning about the past. So that's when I started to do costume. But my actual career was quite different. Of my generation, we tended to be led by our parents and told what we could do or should do. So I ended up becoming a dental hygienist, which was, I wanted to go to art college and I got shoved in another direction. So as soon as I could make decisions for myself, as soon as my children were old enough, I went off to university to study history. I loved every single minute of that. It was just a joy. From there, at roughly the same time, because I went to university as a mature student, my daughter graduated in film studies. So, and I said at the time, I can make costume. Do you think it would be of any interest? And she said, no. And she went off doing her own film thing. A lot of it was involved in wildlife photography and filmmaking, which is where Crow's Eye comes from. It began really with Nick's passion for wildlife. And we found that because I was doing costume creatively and I ended up lecturing at university and I was working for museums and things like that, my skill with costume, my knowledge with costume was becoming increasingly useful. So Nick and I were sort of circling one another. Nick was doing stuff and I was doing stuff, and then it gradually came together so that on one occasion, I was working for a the local museum on a 14th century manuscript, and the images in it were extraordinary. They were everyday life in the 14th century, and they were like little comic sketches. And I pointed these out to Nick, and she looked over my shoulder and said, that's a film. So I said, okay, we should do this. And then rolling forward a little bit, Nick continued doing her things and I continued doing mine. And we were approached by a museum to make a film on getting dressed in the 18th century, which was just completely up my street because I had virtually all of the clothing I needed. It's something I had wanted to do to demonstrate the layers of dress and how that silhouette is achieved. So, yes, we took on the job and Nick filmed it, and then we didn't think anything more about it for about 6 months when suddenly, because you see, we'd persuaded my other daughter, Kate, to be the model because being my daughter, she grew up with costume and loved it, and particularly loved the 18th century. So she had sort of grown up with the 18th century. And so we said, look, nobody will see this. It's just going to be in the 18th century gallery in a museum. Nobody will see it. It'll be fine. And she's not an actor. She's not a performer. She's not a model. She's very beautiful, and she was just perfect because she sort of lived it. She understood it. So there wasn't performance required. And she was absolutely lovely. Then she phoned me up one day and she says, Mum, my face is everywhere. What's going on? What had happened was that the museum had put the film online and it had gone viral. It went off spectacularly viral all over the world. And we thought, that was weird. Was that a fluke? Was that just chance? Was it the museum contacts that enabled that to happen? Maybe we should make another one just for ourselves and just see what happens. So we did. 18th century working class clothing, because that was a question that kept coming up. Well, if it was that complicated to get dressed, how did the maid get dressed? So we did that with no expectations at all. We released it on Crow's Eye Productions YouTube channel, which had no subscribers at all. And that went viral. It was, for a day, it was the third most watched video worldwide.
Oh my goodness.
Which was absolutely extraordinary. So we've just carried on doing it. So it was an accident. I'm not trained in costume. I'm a historian. Nick, of course, is a filmmaker. And Liv, who did the 18th century working class woman, has stayed working with us because she's multi-skilled. She's a model. She does voiceover work. She's a hair and makeup artist, and she's so creative too. You should talk to her as well. She does the most extraordinary headdresses, hand beaded and just amazing. And she just seems to just throw all of these things off effortlessly. So yes, so it's the three of us. It's me and Nick and Liv, and we rope in whoever else is interested in being in one of the films.
The 18th century video, the last time I looked, it had like 9 million views or something crazy.
I know, they are crazy, aren't they? Yes, I find it hard to get my head around, but it with the advertising, it means that we can earn some money. It varies, of course, and at the moment things are a bit flat because we can't really produce much interesting material. But it should become self-financing soon. We should be able to manage, and that is such a privilege and such a joy to be able to basically get up in the morning and say, what are we going to do today? Where in time are we going to travel now? We sit there. I know, exactly. We have the most exciting meetings where we all get carried away with wonderful ideas.
So what do you think it is about these getting dressed videos that are so interesting to folks? Like, what is driving that immense interest? I mean, 9 million views, and not just on that video. I mean, you've got millions of views on the other videos too. So what do you think is behind that interest?
We've puzzled over this too. I think it's the bit of history you don't get, for a start. You can look at a painting, you can look at a sculpture, you can look at a garment in a museum, but you don't get that whole picture and understanding that. But I think it's much more than that. I think it's because it is so intimate, and it's the process that we go through every day. And I think that is fundamentally what's behind it. We're intrigued because they look so different. It looks so different, and yet it's so familiar.
It connects people across
I think
time.
so.
Yeah.
I think so, yes.
Right, because what we get taught in school, I mean, schools and teachers are limited in what they can and can't do, but, you don't get that sense of, like, what was real daily life like. And so
Yes.
Clothing and food and things like that really kind of help connect in that way.
Yes. Yeah, they break down those barriers between us and them.
So what was your, what did you study in university in terms of history? Was there a specific time frame that you were focusing on?
It was it's what's called heritage studies. So it was the evidence of history, really. So it was everything from archaeology to architecture to the history of dress we did touch on as well, to literature. It was a very broad package, and for someone who's very visual, it was a very exciting way of approaching history.
Was there a particular time frame that you enjoyed in that kind of broad view?
Not a particular time frame. I think I'm immensely curious about the past. I would be immensely curious about the future if that were possible too. I'm just curious about the human condition and the way, and trying to understand, trying to empathize and sort of get into, in terms of dress, it's the sort of logic of dress. There's a rationale behind the way people dress. Sometimes you can't get to it, but there will be.
And there must be some pretty surprising things you've learned. Like I learned about pockets. The eternal quest for women is pockets in your dresses, and they actually had it in the 18th century.
Yes, and that was the first video. That was why we thought that had gone viral. We thought, oh, it's just because of the pockets. but that was I think that was part of it.
Did you ever have the urge to play dress up, or was it more, when you were a child, or was it more the act of creating and sewing that was interesting for you?
As a child, I did love dressing up. That was, I loved that. But as an adult, I have not had much interest in doing it. I'm interested in dressing other people, and I'm interested in getting the details right. But I think it's because I'm not a performer, and I'm not an actor. I like to be in the background. I don't like to be in the foreground. So I don't have those performance skills or desires or motivations that would make me want to kind of dress up and be the center of attention. Very happy for somebody else to do that.
Well, I'm grateful that you came on the podcast then. So thank you. So have people come to you with kind of sticky costuming questions or historical questions that surprised you? Yeah,
well, it's hard to answer that one because I have never done any costume work for anybody else because it's too much like hard work. I want it to be a pleasure. I don't want it to become a burden. And if I were to ever try to make clothes for money, I would hate it very quickly, and I don't want to do that. I think the stickiest challenge is always size and getting people's measurements right. And if they supply their measurements, they're not always correct, and that could be a dilemma. That's the stickiest thing, I think.
You make all the costumes yourselves, and I know watching some other costumers, there's a little bit of a kind of a divide, like hand sewing using period techniques versus using, a sewing machine or combining. Where do you kind of fall on that spectrum?
I fall in the spectrum of if I do any more hand sewing, I will destroy my hands completely. Pragmatic.
Yeah.
I will not do any machine sewing where it shows.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, it's of a period when the machine, because the machine was commonplace in the 1880s. So obviously anything after that period. So I will do all long seams that can't be seen by machine. And I love hand sewing, but I can see the effect it's having on my hands, years and years of hand sewing. But yes, it's very tranquil hand sewing. I do enjoy it. So
now, what was the most difficult costume that you've had to make thus far?
I haven't done anything too difficult. Not yet. I'm contemplating Queen Elizabeth I.
Oh, my goodness.
And that would be complicated. And I think that would be teamwork because I would need gold work embroiderer and specialists involved. So I don't do embroidery. So I think difficult really in terms of the length of time it takes to make things. They can take ages. It can take 3 months to make an outfit.
Wow. And so do you also make like the underpinnings, like the corsets or the shifts or whatever? Or
I do. Yeah, I do all of that. I do the whole thing. Although I haven't had much training in terms of sewing and making costume, I did a couple of the courses done by a corset maker, and he was brilliant. And he taught me basically how to make corsets and how to make 18th century stays. And one other person, Susie Clark, I worked with, and she told me how to work without patterns. And that was, both those things were completely liberating, particularly working without patterns, because once I discovered how they worked in the past, how they drafted the pattern to the figure, that just released me and I was off. Right, I know how to do this now.
When did patterns, like published patterns, become a thing?
I think it was an American, might even have been Butterick. Later 19th century, really from then. And when mail order comes in the 20th century, things change quite remarkably.
I'd like to learn a little bit more about the work that you've done with heritage societies and museums. So you did the video for the 18th century exhibit. What other stuff have you done, costuming or not, with those different groups?
I ran an archaeology group for a few years where we discovered the archaeology of our village. We basically did field walking, which is you walk every field and you're divided out sort of 10 meters apart, and you walk straight across the field, picking up all the artifacts, and you record where everything was found. And we found everything going right back to the Bronze Age. It was a particularly remarkable village in that it had Bronze Age burial mounds all down one side alongside the river. I love doing that. We've left that village now 25 years ago, and I now live somewhere else. But an archaeology group has been initiated here, and that's very exciting. I haven't done field walking for a long time, but we can't do anything at the moment, of course, because of lockdown and social distancing and all of the risks of contagion. So although the group has been sort of mooted, nothing has happened and nothing can happen for a while, but that's rather lovely.
What surprises you about studying history or costuming? What has been most surprising to you in the course of that study?
I'll tell you the thing that most people ask, and that is, how did they go to the toilet in that? How did they use the lavatory? So, because clothes are complicated, but they are still essentially, we are biological beings, and it has to work with our biology. We have to be able to breathe, move, eat, etc. So, and pregnancy and how adaptations of pregnancy. So it's the most surprising thing. I think the idiocy of costume sometimes.
Okay.
It gets absolutely ludicrous. Oddly enough, I think it's also men's clothing that goes off into the extremes.
How so?
Beribboned pantaloons and excesses and just, cod pieces, just and showing off as much leg as possible and ending up looking like toddlers. I think so. I think it is the extremes that fashion can run to.
What is a cod piece about? What was that? What was the thinking there?
Well, it is basically, it covers the opening, the fly opening, basically. It is the fly. It covers that in the front of the hose. And in order to make it more discreet so that it's not kind of revealing any bulges, I think they padded them a little bit initially. And it's that padding just got more and more and more extravagant, more and more boastful. Yes, I don't know really. Yes.
Oh my gosh. So is there a historical period that you haven't created clothing for yet that you are really excited about getting into?
I haven't done much in the 20th century. I've just yesterday made a 1940s dress, but I very rarely look into 20th century. I haven't done a great deal of aristocratic Elizabethan. I've done working class Elizabethan. I think that would be rather wonderful. Yes, I'm also intrigued by very, very much earlier clothing as well. What tiny fragments we have of the Bronze Age and Iron Age would be really intriguing.
How would you go about doing research or reconstruction on something like that?
I think in that case, I'd probably talk to somebody called Sally Pointer. She's been doing some brilliant research and experimental archaeology. So I think we'll probably work with her, because there is no point to me attempting to cover the ground that she has already done so brilliantly. And she's doing a lot of the things that I have thought about doing for some time, but doing it superbly.
When you're constructing a piece of clothing, what is your research process into, before you even get started doing the work, what is your research process?
It's very visual at first. It'll be doing just Googling something and looking for all of the images. And of course, if it's 20th century, you've got, or even 19th century, you've got photography. Then prior to that, you've got paintings and etchings and cartoons, and you've got sculptures. You've got, of course, the actual costumes that survive as well. I hate the word costume. It should be clothing. Costume is something that you don't wear normally. So, but it is clothing. It is people's clothing. So you're looking at original clothing, and often trips to museum to look at original clothing as well. But the process is visual to start off with before I get into the technicalities.
Have you had the chance to go, put your hands on, with gloves, of course, extant pieces of clothing?
Yes, yes, that's always a pleasure. Yes, and there's always exciting discoveries to be made there. But the thing is that things that excite me are probably not things that would excite people generally. It's when I figure out how something is made. Oh, that's how they did it. That's the sort of thing that is incredibly revealing and useful. And also discovering those little hidden pockets that you don't know about when you look at a garment, because pockets are hidden. You don't want to show where you're carrying stuff. So you find all those beautiful ways that they find of include. I was looking at a wedding dress, an absolutely gorgeous mid-Victorian wedding dress, absolutely beautiful. And there in the skirt was a pocket concealed in the seam, presumably to take a handkerchief or something like that. But yes, I do love looking at clothes, original clothing.
I was doing some research for a book that is now never going to see the light of day, but it's a late 19th century, early 20th century time period. And I was able to see, put my hands on this woman's dress from, 1890-ish. And it was like being transported. It was like I had this tangible connection with someone from 100 years before. And it's like you get to have this short conversation over the centuries with someone who's gone. I love that about it.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it as well, conversation. I always feel going to see an item of clothing, it's like I'm about to interview somebody. I'm about to interview the dress, and I have to make sure I remember all the questions I need to ask while they're there in front of me.
Right.
So a conversation that is very much like that. And it's an incredibly precious and very intimate and very real thing, connecting with something. Is you can see the sweat stains, and you can see their height and their shape, and particularly early clothing which was made to the figure, you can see that one shoulder was higher than the other, or you can see the person that wore the garment.
Have you found any strange little quirks in any of the clothing that you've looked at?
Well, I have found that they make a mistake that I do, which is accidentally leaving pins inside a garment. So yes, I'm not alone. I have to actually go through a garment when I finished it just to make sure, because if you've made something really, really complicated, it's usually in the hem. It's just not usually a problem. But I have found examining a pair of Tudor breeches, and there was still a pin inside, wedged in the very tight cartridge pleating. And it had been there all the time, and it's still there. And it obviously didn't cause any harm. But yes, it was nice to know I'm not alone.
Doing this costuming and being interested in history, it kind of branched off into Crow's Eye. Has it branched off into any other interests that you hadn't anticipated?
I think it probably will. We were just kind of getting into our stride when the pandemic swept across us all. And then we had to just sort of sit back and think, well, what can we do? There are things that we would like to do in terms of filmmaking. We would like to do much more ambitious material. But for the time being, what our bread and butter are these costume films. Once the pandemic started, we just had to sit back and think, well, what can we do? We've been able to do some material with social distancing, with just Nick and Liv going out. And we thought, well, we can at least film the countryside for people who can't get out into the countryside and see a little bit of the seasons as they happen and things as they're growing in the beautiful countryside that we have around us, and put Liv in costume just to make it a little bit more visual. Other things. I think we were just too busy, because this has all happened really, really fast. we were just too busy initially, and then things just crashed with the pandemic. So we've just been sitting back and gathering ourselves. And actually, that's quite a nice feeling, because I felt for a while I was sort of always running to catch up, and then suddenly the brakes are on, and you think, oh, I don't have to do that, and I don't have to get in the car, and I just don't have to do anything. And so I've discovered gardening. I'm not a gardener, but I've discovered how lovely it is just being outside when there's nothing else you can do. So I'm finding, in the midst of the terror and horror that is the pandemic, I'm finding peace and tranquility at the core of it, which is curious.
The videos, I have to say, the Walk With Me videos, they got me through a couple rough weeks. So thank you.
Oh, that's lovely. I've heard quite a few people say that, which is really, really sweet. And they're lovely. And we watch them as well. That's the funny thing. They're just so, she's a very, very relaxed, very tranquil person. And the whole ethos around what we do is very caring. It's very thoughtful. I mean, we're the tricky thing is that we're showing women getting dressed, and we're trying to make sure that that's done in a way that is very safe, where the actor feels safe, where they are protected, and we're not in any way exploiting them physically to get the ratings, as it were. This is, so we have a very tiny film unit, which helps as well. But the whole personality around it is of a very caring, very loving, very tranquil process. And I think that comes over to the audience. I think they feel some of the tranquility that we feel in making them. They're always a very, very lovely experience, beautiful locations, wonderful museum staff that we work with. It's a very enjoyable process, and I think some of that comes over.
It does for sure. Well, and it kind of honors like you said, the intimacy of what you're showing and that connection across time. It's lovely. I can't say enough nice things about it.
Thank you.
So we're talking about all this fun stuff, but what frustrates you about the process of making the clothing or filmmaking or history? What's frustrating for you?
Finding the right fabrics can be frustrating. And we're still working on a shoestring budget, so that is also a little bit frustrating. At the moment, of course, I can't get anywhere or do anything, so I'm entirely reliant upon what I've got in stock. But there's creativity there as well, which is quite nice. One of the frustrating things is, because our budgets are small, we can't fit actors before we film. That's always a bit nerve-wracking. So I have to rely on the measurements that they send, and actors are generally very good at sending the correct measurements. So they send me the measurements, I make the garments, and I just have to nervously keep my fingers crossed that they are actually going to fit on the day. The technique I use is to get a mannequin that is slightly smaller than the figure of the actor, and then I wad it up to match their measurements so that it has all of the right curves in the right place. And then I make the clothing on top of that. And it works. It's only occasionally have I had problems. But if I could do fittings, it's much better. If I've had a problem, it's because I haven't been able to do the fittings. If something isn't quite right on the day, it's because there was nothing I could do. The actor worked in London. We couldn't afford to get them to come up on the train just for fitting. So yeah, that I think is the most frustrating bit. Just it's budget issues. We all have them, don't we?
Right. Right. Oh, so what do you do if an actor shows up and their costume or their clothing doesn't fit? Like, do you have to quickly pin it up, or what? How do you deal with it?
Yeah, that has happened. We have quickly pinned things up on the day, but that's usually for extras. It's not usually the main character. It hasn't really gone badly wrong. There are some that I thought, well, that could have been better. But if there's something, say there is something about what I've made which isn't historically accurate, like maybe I've used metal eyelets where they should have been. Because sometimes we'll think, right, we'll do this period. I've got resources made previously, but the corset or the stays are accurate, but they've got metal eyelets. So I'll just say to Nick, just don't film them. Just to show the lacing so you can't see the metal eyelets. So we don't sort of throw in anachronisms. But yes, we have that because it's not live, it's edited, it's film. We control exactly the angles things are going to be seen from. I could just say to Nick, just don't show that bit.
How many pieces of clothing do you have in your library, so to speak, now?
I have absolutely no idea. I did try to start making a database, but it drove me crazy. Mainly so it's not insured. That's the thing. Because we tried to insure it and they wanted everything itemized. And I started to itemize it and I started to go slightly mad. And I thought, I can't do this. I still need to do something about that. Hundreds and thousands. We've got, it's a converted garage, so it's not huge, but we've got racks that are 2 stories high. All the walls are lined with boxes stacked to the ceiling. I've got things hanging from the ceiling. I've got crinolines hanging from the ceiling. Each time I make something, I think, where am I actually going to put this? But it's an amazing resource to have. It's been created over years. Partly accidentally. Apart from working for Crow's Eye Productions, I occasionally work with another filmmaker locally, Urban Apache Films. They do feature-length films just because they are really talented and I'm really happy to support them and that they're local to me. And of course, they do stuff for us. They come in and act or do voiceover material for us. And the students at Lincoln University, I occasionally work with them and costume their films. So I keep making costume and thinking, where am I going to put it? But it's so useful to have. It's meant that Crow's Eye Productions, when we grew out of nowhere, could hit the ground running because we had all these resources.
Now, do you also loan your stuff out to museums or reenactors?
Not at all. I have done occasionally, but things get lost, don't come back, get damaged. And I think it's taken me, 3 months to make that outfit, and it would take me 3 months to replace it. So it's even if people put it to, it's not worth it, is it? I'd much rather we keep the resource for ourselves. And as I say, I do work with university students and small local things and charities, whatever I can, I'll do helpfully. But fancy dress is an absolute no. Because yes, drinking and wearing that, no.
Nope. So if you had one wish about historical clothing, historical clothing, or Crow's Eye, what would that wish be?
Being able to do more of what we do, to be able to scale up what we do, to create more opportunities for people than we are able to at the moment. So I think my wish is that we grow enough so that we can expand and yes, create opportunities.
If a listener is new to historical clothing or filmmaking and they want to get involved, they're interested in perhaps making clothing themselves, or how would you recommend they get started?
I think one way is to do sort of what I do. I work with the university. If you're interested in costume, I would contact, if you're near a university, I would contact them to see if they have a film department or a theatre or a nearby theatre or a local theatre, anywhere that you can develop your art as a volunteer initially. So really, you've just got to get the experience. And I would say the most important thing is to embrace mistakes, because they're constant. It's what happens. And if you're making mistakes, you're pushing your boundaries, you're learning new stuff, you're breaking through your reserves into learning new things. And mistakes can sometimes take you into an area which it hadn't occurred to you to do it that way before, and it might turn out to actually to be better. Embrace the mistakes. Never, ever, ever get put off. Think, I've made a mistake, I'm going to throw it away, I'm not going to do it again. No, I make mistakes all the time. You just unpick. You've learned something and you tend not to make the same mistake again. Embrace mistakes and get on with it. Enjoy.
Besides the Crow's Eye YouTube channel, obviously, are there other costumers or historians that you would recommend listeners to check out?
There's a lot. American Duchess, they're very good. They've done a couple of beautiful books as well. They do reproduction period shoes for a start, which is how I came across them. And they've since done a lovely book on dress in the 18th century. It's a really user-friendly book and beautifully researched and beautifully illustrated. So if you want to make 18th century dress, I would go to American Duchess. They've also done another one on hair and makeup for the 18th century.
Awesome. Well, Pauline, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for taking so much time to chat with me. I'm very grateful.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much to Pauline for being so generous with her time. You can find Crow's Eye Productions on YouTube and Instagram as Crow's Eye Productions, and on Twitter as Crow's Eye UK. You can find Pauline on Twitter and Instagram as Period Wardrobe. Also, Pauline shared some of her favorite costuming resources, which I'll link to in the show notes. Also in the show notes will be links to Pauline's favorite nonprofits and a rotating list of my favorite nonprofits as well. Just a reminder that you can find the podcast on Instagram at LoveWhatYouLovePod, on Twitter at WhatYouLovePod, and the website is lovewhatyoulovepod.com. Zeke Rodriguez-Thomas at MindJam Media provided amazing editing assistance. You can find Zeke at mindjammedia.com. Also, humongous thanks to Emily White, as always, for the episode transcripts, which are available to patrons at patreon.com/lovewhatyoulovepod. If you need transcription services, definitely reach out to Emily. She's great. You can find her at hireemilywhite@gmail.com. Be good to yourselves, be good to each other, and love the hell out of whatever it is that you love. You need it, and we need it. Thanks for listening. Let's hang out again soon.
There's some good in this world, Mr. Fergal. And it's worth fighting for.